Okay, welcome back to the Snap. Michael Heaver here, of course, alongside my co-host Patrick O'Flynn. And Patrick, it's good to be back again.
It's cracking to be back, and I told you the sunshine was on its way back as well. So where I am bathed in sunshine today, and an awful lot going on in the world of politics.
Absolutely, an awful lot, as you say. And before we get going, guys, please, if you haven't yet, make sure you hit subscribe and the bell to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the Snap. Me and Patrick do these shows regularly on the channel, so make sure you're subscribed. And I think we've got to start off, Patrick, first of all, with, there's been some interesting reports, we could call them, over the last few days, centered around really Lord Frost. And there's been claims, for instance, ahead of Lord Frost's meeting with the EU's Maros Šefčovič about a potential EU plan. Well, first of all, the fact that they don't really like David Frost, Lord Frost, who, of course, was the UK's chief Brexit negotiator under Boris Johnson's government. Firstly, the EU clearly don't like him. And secondly, we've been hearing a bit about they're going to try and divide the British government, the EU, and divide Boris Johnson from Lord Frost. And of course, that all ahead of the meeting that took place today between Frost and Maros Šefčovič. And we've heard some comments coming out from that meeting now.
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's questions was having none of this divide and rule. And he's made clear Lord Frost will accompany him at the G7 summit this weekend, and described him as the greatest Frost since the Great Frost of 1709. So Boris Johnson signalling there that everything Lord Frost is doing has got his full backing. But we're coming, it's classic Brexit negotiating brinkmanship at the end of this month. Sort of transitional arrangements on the Northern Ireland Protocol lapse, and an extra layer of controls is due to be started. But as we know, particularly on the unionist side, this is causing a lot of angst in Northern Ireland. Lord Frost adopting a really trenchant and forthright position, saying the protocol can potentially work. It's not working at the moment. The EU is accused of adopting an extremist purist agenda for implementing it. And we could get to the end of the month and Britain could simply decide unilaterally to roll over the present arrangements where it doesn't implement large parts of the protocol. So, this is causing a lot of aggro among the old Remainer contingent, who are saying Britain's being disgraceful. But the fact is, it's a power play here. And I do think, given the integrity of the UK, that if the EU doesn't budge, then Boris Johnson will simply pull the plug on the protocol altogether later in the summer.
Yeah, really interesting that in the comments that Lord Frost has been making, and I think he wrote an article recently as well, very clear that from his point of view, the British government are ruling nothing out. And I believe he was asked today about the prospect of invoking Article 16, Lord Frost quote on that: "There's a range of things we may consider, and we continue to consider them." So pretty clear to me that Lord Frost, as I said, ruling nothing out. But certainly, and I do find this interesting, that I think the EU are finding things very uncomfortable with Lord Frost. And I think this is perhaps a legacy, a follow-on from the sort of contrast of the relationship that they had with the people who worked under Theresa May. And I think it's very clear that those in the EU recognise they can't just steamroll Lord Frost. And as I said, there's been some reports that the EU now even considering trying to sort of isolate Boris Johnson. Such is their disdain for Frost. And I certainly think from Brexit Britain's point of view, that can only be a good thing. At the end of the day, in negotiations and standing up for the country, you don't necessarily want the EU to be terribly comfortable with Frost in that role anyway.
No, that's absolutely right. And there's no doubt Boris Johnson and Lord Frost wouldn't really have had something like the Northern Ireland Protocol had they been leading the negotiations for Brexit from the outset, rather than Theresa May and Ollie Robbins, who just asked Brussels how high they should jump. So she and Robbins took on this onerous duty for the UK. Then not only wouldn't we do anything to impose a hard border in Ireland, but we wouldn't do anything that would lead the EU to think that they should either. So we lost all our leverage. That's why we ended up with the protocol as the price of just getting out on otherwise reasonable terms. But it's a battle of political wills. And I do think ultimately there's more willpower in the UK, and the UK government has more political strength than there is dissipated across 27 other EU member states. So we may have a bit of a trade war later in the summer, but fundamentally, I think a deal will get done and it will involve the EU budging.
Now, Patrick, another issue that I know you've been writing about is something that people are rightly very, very concerned about. Yet again, is yet another year of we're seeing spiraling illegal migrant boat crossings across the Channel. Recently, we saw 560 people over one weekend, including 336 people on 19 boats, on one day alone. And so far, the number of migrants illegally reaching the UK via small boats is more than double the rate of 2020, which itself was more than 4 times the rate we saw in 2019. So this is spiraling at a very rapid pace. And of course, we've seen Home Secretary Priti Patel say a lot of things, promise a lot of changes, but the facts are the facts, Patrick, and the facts are the numbers continue to spiral upwards.
Yeah, I'm always happy to praise this government when it gets something right, but equally, we've got to give it a spanking today. This Conservative government put forward an action plan last summer, which was supposed to deal with this issue and make the crossings, they said, totally non-viable. Instead, they're running 2.5 times at what they were last year. There's an attempt always to blame France somehow. Well, Brexit was about taking back control. This country and its government should be responsible for its own borders. And Priti Patel and her ministers need to tell the British people honestly why their action plan has failed, why we're sending our own border force vessels into French waters now to pick up migrants. We seem to be exacerbating the pull factor for people to try their luck. The whole thing is a total shambles, and the government should hang their heads in shame. But equally, the opposition parties in Parliament are deliberately turning a blind eye to this. Labour MPs are more interested in berating Priti Patel for putting the migrants in Napier barracks and rather than 4-star hotels, which is music to her ears, because being accused of being too tough is what she wants all day long. But in fact, the Home Office is an abject failure on this. And if a parliamentary party doesn't step up to the plate and start challenging the government, if the government doesn't start raising its game, then perhaps Reform UK, which under Nigel Farage last year made a big thing of this, will get into it again. But I think there are millions of British people who are absolutely sickened about what's going on. And although they wouldn't switch from the Tories to Labour, it does make them wonder whether this government is on their side.
Now, Patrick, if we had anything resembling a serious opposition in Parliament, a potential party of government, you would have thought the Labour Party really would be leading the charge on an issue like the illegal migrant boat crossings. But instead, and I'm actually quite surprised, the lack of oomph, the lack of impetus that we've seen from Keir Starmer as Labour leader since that disastrous set of elections. Since that happened, Patrick, I can't name a single policy, a single thing Starmer's done of note, except for sit down with Piers Morgan for an hour. And this is reflected in the Ipsos Mori Evening Standard polls that now show 14 months in, Keir Starmer's personal leadership ratings, personal popularity with the great British public is at the same level as Jeremy Corbyn's.
Yeah, I think the penny is finally dropping among the sort of centre-left London commentary class that this guy is a dud. He's had his chance. He's failed to make an impact. He was very poor at the Commons dispatch box again today at PMQs. Most of the Labour MPs in there spent the whole session just looking at their smartphones. There was no cheering for him. And that poll you mentioned, comparing his ratings to Boris Johnson, another thing that I think it was Ipsos Mori poll did was poll Andy Burnham's ratings, which are now ominously good. Right up there actually with Boris Johnson as a capable prime minister. Now, that's all very well in theory. I suspect if Andy Burnham were Labour leader, it wouldn't work out that way in practice. But nonetheless, it's interesting. And Burnham's putting himself about again today. He's been on a radio show stating his opposition to the woke Oxford students who are planning to take down a portrait of the Queen. So he's putting himself on the common sense side of culture war rows. This guy's an operator. and he's manoeuvring. You know, he can't be Labour leader yet because he's not in the Commons, but clearly he's gradually putting a stranglehold on Keir Starmer, and Starmer is looking worse and worse by comparison.
Well, you can be sure we're going to keep you abreast of all the very latest developments coming, guys. So make sure, as I said, you hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next episode. And myself and Patrick will see you again soon. Cheers, guys.
See you soon, folks.